Well, hello everybody. Max of Pilots and Prop Wash here, and I thought I would talk about the pilot shortage. It's the looming subject in aviation. It seems to be trending very well on the YouTube, and I've seen a lot of videos about it. A lot of great guys with a lot of good input, and I thought I would just give sort of my personal view on it, which is coming from a different angle. I'm not going to get into numbers or anything like that. I'm more looking at why people don't really want to become pilots so much anymore. And also I thought I would talk a little bit about my background and my road. Some of these videos have talked about the ups and downs of aviation. That's true. And well, so here we go. Now, when I first started flying in the 1970s, it was a very different world. The requirements were lower, and a lot of pilots were really interested in the airlines, but the Vietnam War had just ended. There was a recession, so that meant there were a lot of military pilots on the street with all kinds of flying credentials. So for the civilian pilot, it was really hard to break in. I can remember joke advertisements. Actually, it was on the cover of a book once about becoming a pilot, and it talked about how they were looking for a flight instructor in a Cessna 150 to occasionally do a little day charter in their Cessna 172, and they wanted 10,000 hours and ATP and 3 moonshots. And that was kind of a running gag. Now, it took forever for me to get my ratings for a lot of reasons I won't bore you with, so I got into the flying game kind of late. And I also came in at one of the worst possible times. There were so many unemployed pilots that the regional airlines were paying less than $600 a month. In fact, my former airline, Mesa Airlines, as a regional carrier, they had several different divisions, and the Western division paid mileage. You didn't get paid by the flying hour, but the miles you flew. And if you were on reserve, you got a 0-mile line, and you made nothing unless you flew. Eventually they unionized, but when I went to work as a Beech 1900D first officer in 1997-98, I took home $248 a week. That was $2 a week less than I had made on unemployment. That always cracked me up. Of course, you have to remember being a first officer at a commuter airline is largely an apprenticeship. But things were starting to tighten up. The pilot pool was starting to get smaller. The Vietnam era guys were starting to retire. There was a little bit of movement. The economy started to pick up. Now you have to remember, there's an old adage in aviation. When the economy gets a cold, aviation gets pneumonia. And that's really not much of an exaggeration. It is an extremely economy-sensitive industry. Starting an airline is generally about the most insane way you can think of to try and make money, but some people make it work. Looking at you, Dave Nealman. But the thing that was really different then than now, I think, was a little more cultural. And I talked about this in my age 65 rule video a little bit. I'm of a generation that grew up working on cars, building model airplanes. We were a very mechanical group, and we just loved, well, frankly, pilots love toys. And airplanes, they're like the coolest toy out there. Well, maybe next to rocket ships, but I digress. What I have seen happen is a shift in the interest of youth. Now, you can blame the internet or video games or whatever you want. I'm not going to get into the societal factors that caused this shift. The simple fact is the new generations don't grow up working on cars. They don't seem to have much interest in them outside of getting point A to point B. I know a lot of kids who are 18 years old before they get their driver's license. And I actually know some adults that take Uber and Lyft everywhere. Now, I know in some major cities it's not uncommon to not know how to drive because of the difficulty in owning a car in a major city like New York. So taking buses, trains, Ubers, that's kind of the norm. But I'm talking about suburban and rural kids who would have been the first ones to want to get their license. I was standing at the DMV on my 16th birthday to get my driver's license, and just about every kid I knew did the same. Now, what has this got to do with the pilot shortage? Well, I think this is kind of the genesis of it. Mechanical stuff, jobs where you work with your hands just don't seem to be as popular. And this isn't just aviation. You listen to the celebrity Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs. He's talking about how it's hard to get kids into the trades and everything. There's a big shortage of everything, including mechanics and now air traffic controllers. This isn't just the cockpit. It's just one of the more visible ones. Right now, a young person who doesn't know what they want to do with their life has got a lot of great opportunity to make some money in the meantime if they just will learn some competencies. Go to 2 years to a trade school and learn to be an A&P mechanic, and you will have a job walking out. I can virtually guarantee it. Or if you're walking out of college and you don't want to know what you want to do, look at being an air traffic controller. These jobs have a much lower threshold to entry because in the case of an air traffic controller, the government trains you, and in the case of a mechanic, the school is simply less expensive. But if you want to be a pilot, you're looking at a massive commitment in time, money, and effort, and quite frankly, sweat. And that's just to get your ticket so you can get a job to really go out and learn. Now, when I started learning to fly, minority and female pilots were around. They weren't that common, but they were around. Now their numbers have increased greatly, and that's a wonderful thing because we need the pilots. As aviation gets more sophisticated, in some ways it gets easier, in some ways it gets harder. It's much easier to navigate. They don't even teach some of the approaches I learned as a kid. They don't teach ADF, NDB approaches anymore, anything like that. No one uses them. It's all GPS, and that's great because that makes flying safer. The aircraft are more complicated and sophisticated than the older aircraft, but they're also much safer and much more fuel efficient, so this is great. That also makes it easier to train new people who need to be somewhat tech savvy because airplanes are now flying more and more on electronic technology and less on needle ball, airspeed, gas, and guts. Another thing that's contributed to this shortage, of course, is military aircraft are so much more capable and so much more expensive that we don't have as many of them anymore. So the military is not pumping out thousands of pilots like it used to. That means that the airlines now have to look more to the general aviation sector, corporate, flight instructing, commuter airlines, and the commuter airlines have a ravenous need for pilots. They almost can't keep them. The airlines basically pilfer their pilots largely from the regional airlines, so the regional airlines are in a constant state of training. The upside for pilots is this has resulted in increases in pay. Some people say pilots aren't paid enough. That's highly subjective. It also depends on who you fly for. But the real thing I think that's keeping a lot of young people away from aviation is simply they're not raised with it like they used to be. They're not culturally interested in it the way they used to be. And they don't see it as something that appeals to them. They would rather work on a computer or work in an office. Now, if you ask me what's the answer to this, well, I'm not sure there is one. The entire single pilot cockpit thing, which is probably closer on the horizon than I realized, is a stopgap. It would help, but it could create as many problems as it solves. Not the least of which is some pilots will just go, nope, it's a two-person job. If I got to be up there by myself, you got to pay me twice as much. And that whole thing is going to be a nightmare. Yes, pilot pay. And I think another thing, and I'm kind of just grabbing this from thin air, but it's just sort of a feeling that I get, is a lot of the glamour of travel is just gone. Essentially, the airlines have turned into airborne bus lines, and we've seen this with all of the fights and everything that have broken out on airlines and countless videos on that. There are those who claim that's primarily on the low-cost carriers, charge bus prices, get bus passengers. But trust me, it happens on all the airlines. The simple fact is that the airlines are a business. They have to make money. The pilots want a certain level of compensation. The airlines, of course, want to pay as little as they can because their actual fiduciary responsibility is to the stockholder. Often the pilots are stockholders in the companies too. It's understandable why a pilot wants to make a lot of money. They spend a lot of time, like a doctor, getting this training and getting the credentials, and they often have a pretty rocky road to the cockpit, a lot of years spent not making much money, essentially their apprenticeship. So as they move up the ladder, they want to be well compensated for their time and experience. That's only fair. The airlines still have to turn a profit. They can only afford to pay so much. This, of course, explains one of the reasons they work the pilot so hard. You want to make more money, you got to fly more people, etc., 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 sort of a cat chasing its own tail. But in the end, the unions, the management, the pilots, they more or less work out something that works for everybody, and they get a contract and they go back to work. But it can really be ugly. If you've ever been in a union negotiation, it is not a pretty thing. Another thing is all the mergers. You want to see a real bloodbath? Watch two airlines merge. That is right out of Game of Thrones. Sometimes it's some real red wedding stuff. So why do we have a pilot shortage? Well, from a societal point of view, I think part of it's because flying was always hard, but at least it used to be glamorous. Now, not so much. And pilots get patted down at TSA like everybody else, right in front of everyone, and they running all over huge airports, trying to make connections like everybody else, trying to get the plane ready. I mean, there's a lot to it. I've done my share of 4 a.m. wake ups and red eyes and stuff, and that will wear on you. And the airlines do, most of them try to compensate you. You know, you get a night override and things like that. But although it's nice to have a fatter paycheck, when that alarm goes off at 4 a.m., you just really don't want to do it. But that's the job, and a lot of folks just don't want to sign on for that. It's bad on your circadian rhythm. You spend a lot of time in an atmosphere up in the thin air. Even though the cabin is pressurized to 7,000 or 8,000 feet, it's still tough on your body. And you're exposed to more UV. There's just a lot of things, and time changes and everything else. And then there's also the airline bankruptcies. It's a hit and miss industry. A lot of people are telling pilots that if you're going to get in the airline industry, you make a lot of money, but you need to save it and invest it because you never know what's coming down the pipe. In my career, there have been two major events that slowed the industry since it started to pick up. That was 9/11 and the pandemic. And those things, as well as a softening economy or a litany of other things, are all it takes to go from a pilot shortage to a pilot surplus. The planes don't fly, they don't need pilots. We need packages and we need people to fly to stay employed. Right now, times are good. Will it last? Who's to say? Let oil hit $300 a barrel. Who knows? So in a nutshell, we have upcoming generations that want a certain guarantee and a certain security that aviation will probably never provide. Plus, certain loss of glamour and status, the fact that it's a lot of hard work, and you have a generation that just looks at it and goes, I'll do something else. And that's really all it takes to create a pilot shortage. Now, you're always going to have the aviation kids who want to be pilots. That's great. You're going to have those who just see it as a way to make a lot of money. That works too, as long as it keeps them working in the cockpit. But ultimately, I think the change is more generational and cultural than anything else. And it's probably one reason we'll see the single pilot cockpit at some point. Well, that's my 10-cent view from 30,000 feet. Hope you guys are doing well. Take care. Blue skies and tailwinds.